Our guest for this session of The Mindset Shift is Chief Executive of CarsIreland.ie, Ross Conlon. Ross has had a varied career working in large and small companies with roles in software development and technology management, followed by P&L ownership, executive management and director roles. In recent years, Ross has held leading positions in companies such as Independent News and Media, where he worked as Managing Director of New Business Ventures to help expand I&M's business, particularly in relation to its digital operations. He now holds the role of CEO at CarsIreland.ie, which powers the entire online infrastructure for the motoring industry in Ireland.
It's great to have you here this morning.
Thanks, Tim. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
The Mindset Shift talks really about the person first, and then we get on to talk about the business. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a husband and a father of three, primarily. That's my number one job. And the last year, that's kind of taken a fair bit of my time. And at the same time, I work for Independent News and Media, and I run their marketplace platforms.
So let's go back. So where are you from originally?
I'm from Monkstown in Dublin, and I've lived in Dublin most of my life. I did a shift in New York for a year, and currently I live in Blackrock, just down the road from where I grew up. And in
Monkstown, how many in the family? Tell me a little bit about your family.
I have. Well, my father is from Westmeath, my mother's from Dublin, and I have a brother and a sister. My brother is in Department of Foreign Affairs. He did shifts around the world. He's recently in Palestine as effectively the ambassador over there, or Ireland doesn't recognise Palestine as a country yet, but effectively the ambassador. And my sister works in a technology company. She's a technical writer.
So talk to me about growing up in Monkstown. We all have different impressions of different places. So I'm always fascinated by places like Monkstown, as a child growing up. What was it like for you?
Well, to be honest, I had a fairly sheltered upbringing, right? The highlight of my childhood was I was in the Sea Scouts in Dunleary, which was a bit varied. And I did things like canoeing, rowing, camping, and that kind of stuff in my teenage years. That was pretty interesting. And most of my friends, who I still have now, came from that cohort, from that clique. I didn't really play rugby or anything like that. I went to an Irish school, so I'm educated completely in Irish through my whole life, even in college. So I went to Scullercon and then Coláiste Owen, and then on into college, right? So, Monkstown it's a pretty nice place. It's by the sea. Obviously played a lot of football on the roads. People don't do that so much these days. But it was fairly sheltered, and I was very lucky, in all honesty. My parents they put a lot of time into us and focused on education, and maybe gave us a little bit of space when we needed it as well, which was kind of handy, right? I've no regrets in life. I was very lucky and very privileged.
Was Gaeilge spoken in the house, or was it just in school? What was the context of you ending up in an Irish-speaking school through to college?
Yeah, it was just happened to be the closest school, actually, just down the road, right, by just chance. It's called Scullercon. It's a very good school, and actually my kids go there now. So I learned through Irish. It was quite a novelty back in the 80s. I think it's normal now. Almost a lot of kids are educated that way, and in Coláiste Owen, I did secondary school in Irish as well. It was kind of, once you go to primary school, it was the natural evolution, right? And then I did a very unusual course in college that was kind of business through Irish as well. There was no particular reason. It was just a very good course. And turns out, like, even having Irish now, my wife can speak Irish, and it does come in handy every now and then, especially when you're abroad and you want to communicate in a language that no one else understands, right? We just talk on occasion through Irish. And I love it actually as well. Like, it still is part of our culture and part of who we are. So it is still important to me, and still important that my kids understand it.
I'm fascinated about the concept of yourself and your wife having a conversation in Gaelic abroad. Obviously, it does protect what you're talking about for those little periods of time, It
does, yeah. No, it's remarkably useful when you're abroad, right? Because you can speak openly and no one knows what you're saying, right? And because most people just think that you can just speak English, and if you sometimes it helps you get out of conversations as well, right? And it can come in handy just when people are eavesdropping on you and things. You can just communicate privately. It's very useful.
The Sea Scouts, are they just a different version of the Boy Scouts? And they're at sea. Forgive my ignorance of the Sea Scouts, but I've heard of them, but I'm not sure the difference between them and the Boy Scouts.
Yeah, the Sea Scouts, well, they were just based on the West Pier in Dún Laoghaire. If you think about Dún Laoghaire Harbour, it's quite safe because if you fell in the water, you can't go out to sea. You usually end up on one of the piers, right? Yeah, they have a few boats down in just on the West Pier there, and we used to do kind of relatively simple things like rowing and sailing within the harbour. And then on occasion, we went out to Dalkey Island, or on occasion even out to Howth, right? It was a slightly different. I wouldn't say it was safety wasn't an issue, but it was, let's say, safety wasn't such a thing back in the 80s as it is now, right? Like we only had one motorboat. I think these days they've 3 or something like that, right? And we did have obviously buoyancy aids and stuff, but it was very useful because you were given responsibility like at a very young age, maybe at 14 or 15 in a boat, like at sea. And it was quite liberating in hindsight. And then also it helped me. I got into whitewater canoeing as a result, and then I canoed a bit in Scotland and in the Alps as I grew up. Now that's very dangerous, but you wouldn't do it for too long. But it was quite liberating, and just, I suppose, there was just so many different things going on. You could do canoeing, rowing, sailing. You could do competitions. It was just kind of very different, right? And there was some theory things as well. And it was just, I suppose, really, in hindsight, it was about friendships, because you grew up with the same cohort of people doing different skills, entering competitions. And I suppose in hindsight, when you look at it now, it was those friendships that are probably the most important thing. Like I even speak to them regularly now, most of them, right? We used to go out a lot before COVID, down to the pub for chats. And yeah, it really kind of forged the friendship, because the friendship was forged through an experience, or through multiple experiences, good and bad. Like, so that was kind of really that was the brilliance of it, really, you know.
Talk to me about the dangerous aspect of the Alps. That's just an interesting comment you just threw in as you were talking about the Alps.
Yeah, so whitewater canoeing is when you go over kind of weirs or waterfalls and stuff. But in June, all the snow melts in the Alps, so all the rivers rather go into flood. And some canoeists go, and it's around Briançon, which is basically where all the skiing really is, right? And so around June, no one is skiing, but there's a load of canoeists there. But you get into, I suppose, into rivers which you would be, I'm trying to say, it would be in the extreme dangerous, right? Like the height of them, I don't know, might be a few 10-meter drops, rocks everywhere, this kind of stuff. I did it, I think twice, right? That was enough, right? You'd be very, very cautious about doing it. I mean, the injuries were just huge, right? I think there was about, where I was, there was about 500 people there, and every day a few people broke limbs, right? But extremely exhilarating, right? I suppose what happened with canoeing is I brought it as far as you could bring it in Ireland, because there's a level where there's not that many big drops. And then I went to Scotland, and then you brought it as far as you could there, did a few trips there, and then went to the Alps. But you come to a point where you're going, okay, this is really getting hairy, and I'm not comfortable with the level that it's at. Like one of my friends had an accident, nearly drowned, and you're kind of going, okay, this is fun and we're young and all, but maybe we should just take a step back, right? So I paused really after, just when you saw the danger and you're going, okay, not comfortable with this. I don't regret it, but I wouldn't, especially if you've got a family, I wouldn't be doing it again.
It's interesting how our views and things change as we get a little bit older, and as you have a family, the adrenaline rush when you're young, there's no fear of danger. It's just like, this is a wow experience. And then all of a sudden you see a few things happening, and it does frame you. It does give you a different framing, and just developing that point of framing. Tell me about your parents. I mean, your dad was from Westmeath, you said, and your mom was from Dublin. Were they professionals? Did they work in the home, or what was their background?
Yeah, my father worked in Bank of Ireland, which used to be on the big black building on Bagot Street there. I think it's Department of Health now, right? I mean, it was a very different culture there. I can remember when I was younger, I went into his office a few times, and it wasn't open plan. It was everyone had their own office, and it was very different. My mom worked from home, and my father worked on a lot of the analytics in banking, like figuring out interest rates and stuff, right? And still does a bit of it now, actually, for the bank. But it was a very different time back then in hindsight when you look at it. Like, for example, I think my father was where he worked, he was given basically a restaurant lunch every day, right? As part of the deal, right? And I think it was strictly 9 to 5, all this kind of stuff, right? So it was just a different time. But again, I was lucky they didn't come from much like everyone else back then, and they did very well for themselves, and they really looked after us when I was younger. So I count myself as one of the lucky ones, and I'm very thankful for that.
You made a point that education was very important to them, to make sure that children were educated, even though they hadn't been educated to college level. Tell me, when you went to college, what was your ambition? What were you thinking of the future, or did you think about the future? Or was it just you're going to college, you're going to do the program in business through Irish, which is very unusual now, I must say, Ross. That's a very unusual selection, even though you had come through primary and secondary level at college in Irish. But it's still very unusual to go into college and pick an Irish speaking business course, particularly at that point in time, I would imagine. So what was the thought process about what you wanted to do post-college?
It's a good question, right? It's interesting when you look at yourself from now. I mean, I'd love to talk to myself and maybe give myself a clip on the ear, right? I didn't really have a plan, and I was kind of going through a process in hindsight, not really knowing what the results would be. Like when I came to college, like I can remember the day Google started, right, or the week, right? Like I remember kind of going, wow, this is kind of cool, right? And I loved technology. But I didn't really have the experience or the knowledge to understand all the facets that it took to run a business. I kind of thought I did, right? And I kind of wanted to be kind of an entrepreneur and to set up a technology company. That was kind of my high level plan, not realizing what that took, the effort it took, or even the discipline that it took, right? But in college, I was lucky again. Like I was with I had really good peers who were super smart and have been super successful since. I learned a lot from them, and I learned a lot from the lecturers there. I was in DCU, not UCD or Trinity, which was a bit, I suppose, I mean, you could argue it's the third college, right, in Dublin, really, but it was quite business focused, right, and it was quite maybe not as academic, but it was more about, look, will your degree turn into a job afterwards, right? And in hindsight, people were quite defensive then. It was like, if you got a job, you were kind of lucky. Like no one was really looking to do something that ambitious. When I look at it coldly now, like my parents came from a scenario where, like, if you got a pensionable job, that was a result. And I wouldn't call it that was their ambition for us, but they always had that in their back, right? Just make sure the person is safe, and they've got a kind of have you got a mortgage, have you got a pension, all this kind of stuff. That was kind of a baseline for them, and you achieve afterwards. Where I think these days it's quite the opposite. People they're much more open to trying new things. They're more ambitious, right? Just because, I suppose, like the only limit of what you can do now is your mind, really. Like the world has changed unbelievably in 20 years, you know. So, I mean, kids can do things now that we couldn't do back in college, right? So it's a different time.
Let's just tease that out a bit, Ross. Is it that you couldn't do it, or you choose not to do it? Because, you know, we are, I suppose, a result of our parents, you know, their experiences. And, you know, like, your parents were very generous and very kind to make sure that she got the best opportunities that she got. But is it a case that it's so different in college now, or is it a case that you choose what it was back then and they choose what they do today?
Yeah, I think it's down to example and who you can see. Like if you look at people, and if you see people are successful, maybe you kind of go, "Cheapers, I could do that too," right? And there weren't lots of examples, and also access. Like I felt, and I was wrong, but when I was younger, that I maybe you look for excuses, but access to education maybe was harder than it is now. Like education is free, knowledge is free now. Like if you want to get it, you just have to go onto Coursera, or there's lots of things online, right? And I suppose maybe we put a symbolic barrier there, which gave us an out. So the reason why we didn't do it is, we couldn't get this or we couldn't get that. But those barriers don't exist now, right? Now there are other barriers which you can put in, which are maybe, I don't know, the willingness to put in the effort, or curiosity or things like that, right? But I felt, and in hindsight, again, if you could go back again, you would maybe push harder when you were younger, right? I'm not sure I didn't have the ambition. I just didn't really realize how hard you had to work to succeed. Like, it's a fairly competitive world out there now. And I don't know, maybe I felt entitled, I'm not sure. But certainly I possibly could have worked harder.
I would say, Ross, that's an experience that most people in college today have the same view. I think that, if you put an old head on young shoulders, we all would go back and say, I could have worked harder. I could have done a bit more in that sense. So I don't think that has changed. I think what definitely has changed, technology has changed. The things being instant, the responses are immediate, everything. So it's much more in front of us, much more quickly. They have definitely made changes to what goes on in our world today. But I think that's, in my experience, that in reality, many people in college will say, and many people in school, not just college, primary and or second level school, many people will say, I could have worked harder. So I don't think, there's a difference in the 21st century as there was in the 20th century. I think that, that's probably consistent for most people in that sense. So when you go through your college years, though, so you're doing business. Was there anything else out in business, or was it?
It was business and computers, right? It was kind of a joint degree, right? Which was kind of in hindsight good, right? Because as I look at myself now, if you can understand technology in a very detailed way, and then understand business and go into even accounting rules or CapEx rules, or it's very useful if you can understand both at the same time, because that's, I'd say, actually the biggest. I wouldn't call it an advantage, but it's my number one skill is understanding both, because in conversations you can bridge gaps very quickly, and you can get to a result very quickly, right? And then also you can stop messing very quickly, because very frequently people try to say, "Oh no, I know what's right," or "I know what's right," or "I know what's right," and you can go, well, actually, if you look at the whole landscape, it turns out that both you are right, or no, this is the direction we should go, right? And so understanding technology and business, I think, is actually, it's a really useful and it's a really important skill to have these days, right? Especially as things are getting more techie as we go on every year, right? So yeah, that's my number one thing that I'm focusing on now.
So when you left college then with your degree from DCU, what was the first step? Did you travel immediately, or did you go straight into the workplace?
No, I set up a company with a guy from college, not really knowing what I was doing, right? I was trying to get into mobile phone technology, which was called WAP at the time. So back then it was kind of like a dial-up thing, and you could do very simple things on your phone. And yeah, I started on that and completely failed. In all honesty, I tried to get into software development, and I did that for a year or two. I basically got to break even after a year and a half, and I called it quits. I suppose in hindsight, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, right? And I was learning as doing. I didn't work hard enough, and I'd no one to really drive me on but myself, right, and my colleague. We just weren't focused enough, and we didn't really understand the concept of creating a product which had a kind of a reusable use. So build once and then use like a million times. We just didn't have the experience, right? But in hindsight, sometimes you need to fail miserably to realize your mistake, which is what happened, right?
Let's just develop that point. So you just made a point you broke even after a year and a half, but yet you think you failed. I'm just interested in the correlation between both, because many businesses that start up, if they broke even within a year to a year and a half, they would feel that they're on the road to success. So I'm just very interested in your mindset about that particular aspect of your business at that point in time.
Yeah, I think these days what you have to do is focus on scale, right? And it's fine if you get yourself into a break-even business, but that can ultimately never scale. In my view, you should really question that, right? And that's where we got to. Better off focusing on a scenario where you're the only limit is the size of your market, and your market is huge, so you have the potential to scale in a significant way, right? I could never have scaled. I didn't even realize that was the problem at the time, but that actually ultimately was the problem, right? I could have made a few euro, but I wouldn't have had a great life, right? And it wouldn't have worked out long term, right?
So when you made the decision at that point, that's, we've broke even, but we're going over, this is not scalable. And scalable is an important point, because, businesses have different opportunities for scale. Some have obviously international opportunities to scale, and some have more local opportunities. So scale is something that is, I suppose, unique to each business. And that's important that we understand that not every business is scalable. It can take on the world. Some businesses can be very successful and operate within regional and or national markets in that sense. But you decided that, you broke even. I don't believe you'd failed, but you decided this wasn't scalable, I think is probably, to me, a more realistic view of it. What was the next part of the journey?
Yeah, I felt then I just had to learn. I'd kind of realized there was a big gap in my business acumen, right? So I went and worked for a company that did SMS technology. And back in 2000, it was about 2002, I think SMS was just on the cusp of rocketing, right? And they were building they were called SMSCs, but basically SMS engines, right? Integrating with mobile phone networks. And that really took off. And I kind of saw the potential of linking technology and business together, right? And getting into like what scale really meant, right? And I didn't really understand what scale was. And scale is like, I don't know, 1 billion messages. That's scale. And that's the kind of level we got to. I just didn't really you're better off maybe having a product that is basically maybe at a small value but can scale massively than having the opposite, right? So I really understood that over, I worked for that company for a few years, and it took me a while, but I really understood that, and then how to set up a business to scale, and then how to focus on kind of marginal gains, and how so where you get to basically, if your product is 1% or 2% better than your competitor, that you can dominate a vertical or a market just by being a little bit better, right? So that took me a while to understand, really, and focusing on where money, how to invest, and how maybe by using cash flow you can different strategies for outmaneuvering your competitors, right? And linking technology and money in just different ways, right? That was kind of my next kind of journey, and that kind of helped me a lot in hindsight, because sometimes when you look at techies, and I was a techie back then, they're so that the commercial people sometimes struggle with techies. Actually, they always struggle pretty much, right? And I found myself, and it took me a while to realize that actually I was a techie who could understand commercial. I came the opposite way, right? And actually that was very useful in hindsight, right? Because commercial people tend to gravitate towards people who can speak their language, and so I kind of did quite well in the because of that, because I could understand money and technology at the same time. Really helped in my career at that stage.
It's very unusual for a techie, as you described yourself back then, to be looking at all these business sort of opportunities and business understandings, and trying to develop a business acumen about scalability, marginal gains, the things you've just expressed. that wasn't really common within your techie group as you have described it.
Yeah, but like the view I've taken on it is that they're pretty much most techies are better than me at technology, right? And even a lot of commercial people are better than me on that side as well. But where if you can actually just straddle the two of them, you actually can do better, right? Because you can just see both points of view, and you can sometimes influence strategy in ways that neither side would think of, right? Like, for example, a technical person might never think of a user, right, or someone using the thing. And a commercial person mightn't ever think, oh, how hard it is to do something, or if they did it if they asked in a slightly different way, the result would be significantly better. So I realized then that if you could straddle the two, you do a lot better. But the problem I had then, actually, in hindsight, was a lot of people still viewed me as a technical person only, and it's very hard to make to move, right? If people think you're one thing, you are that thing. So that took me a while to figure out, and you really, like, I'm fully now over the other side, but it took me a long time, right, to move over, right? So you find yourself, like, it's very hard to go from if you're like seen as a software developer, you will never get a job as a commercial person. It would be inconceivable, right? So what you have to do is over time move your role gradually to the middle, right? So that's kind of what I did, right?
Okay, so in the SMS company, you were on the software and technology side, and you obviously had a growth for business. So you wanted to straddle both sides. Did the company afford you the opportunity, or was it just you trying to learn from your own, I suppose, thought process? How did you move that needle across from just being seen as a tech person only to a tech and business person? And just one other point. There are people, who can cross both, and there are people who have successfully, built businesses from one side or the other. But to have both just gives you a different advantage, would be my observation.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you move? Yeah. First of all, it takes time to go, because you have to convince people, and obviously communication. Again, when I was younger, I didn't possibly realize the importance of the communication, and then also, sometimes what you're doing there is you're coming in on someone else's role, which always also gets a bit uncomfortable, right, for people. So you just do it gradually over time. I think probably you just try and listen and be curious and understand the needs. And like, I'd be strongly of the view that if you make yourself indispensable, people will always pick you. Like, if you're a footballer and you're always scoring goals, you'll likely be picked the next week. So that's kind of your approach. If you make yourself core to the business, you have to be listened to, because there's no option. That's kind of the approach that I took, right? Gradually, and then just be curious about how things work. I didn't really understand like accounting rules or like CapEx strategy back then, right? But you just listen and you learn and you educate yourself, and over time you learn. At the beginning, maybe you have to be very quiet because you don't understand. And then over time, if you just keep listening, you go, okay. And I suppose if you have good people around you, that's kind of important too, and good mentors, right? They help you along the way. Obviously, you make a few mistakes here and there. Everyone does. When you do, you put your hand up and you just try and go, I made the mistake. This is how I'm going to remedy it. And then you move on.
So you started to create a broader business understanding. What was the next stage of the journey after SMS World?
Yeah, okay. I did that, and I ran. That company got bigger, and it was bought by a PLC called Zamino, right? And we ran that for a few years, and then I became the CEO of that company, which was a PLC, right? Albeit a very small one. And that kind of forced me to learn a lot of things, like when you're director of a public company, there's kind of extra responsibility in terms of accounting and communication and shareholder management and transparency. So sometimes when you put yourself in the deep end, you have no option but to learn and do things in a certain way. And again, I had a few good people around me then, and even some very simple messages can sometimes help you. I mean, I think the best bit of advice I ever was given, I think, was always keep it between the rails. Because if you go outside of the rails once, you'll do it continuously, right? So if you just have a rule and never break it, you should be fine. So ethics become pretty important, and some things you will just not compromise on, because ultimately it'll catch you out over time. So it took me a while to understand that, but if you've got good people giving you sometimes very simple messages, and maybe repeatedly, in my case, they had to be driven into me, you're usually fine. And if you just ask advice, like I find sometimes you have to ask for help, like, and people are very good at, like, people you respect tend to be good with their time if you treat them with respect back. Like if someone gives you a message or a bit of advice, and you listen to them, and you go back to them a year later and you just tell them your experience and their advice, they'll probably help you more. But if you don't treat people with respect, they tend maybe not to communicate with you in the future, right? So it's more about an exchange with people, right? And even again, that took me a while to understand, especially as my career developed and I got communication with very, very senior people in Irish business, right? You have to respect their time, and sometimes you only get a short period for, even in an annual basis, the really senior people. But if you listen to what they say, they are communicating sometimes in code, right? But if you listen and you follow, you can usually learn, right?
What's interesting about the stay within the rails, I would talk to clients about only set rules that you're going to enforce, because many businesses set rules that they break them, and then all of a sudden the people say, well, it's not really a rule, and there's no rule in this company. So my guidance would be only set the rules you are going to enforce, and then enforce them completely, because there are certain things, your description of don't go outside the rails is a nice way of saying it. But I talk about being in lanes in a running track, stay within your lanes. So it's similar concept. You slip very quickly into the fact that you in the SMS company, that it was taken, it was bought, and then you became the CEO. How did you get from being a techie to the CEO of a company, and then particularly a PLC company? Just tell us about that journey, because that just kind of slipped in there very quickly, Ross. So I thought I'd missed something, but I obviously didn't. It's just the way you just. No,
I suppose what happened was we were in a company and it was doing quite well, and then in 2008 a downturn came in, and the management team were wiped out effectively, and there was only a few people left, and the shareholder basically over a couple of years later, there was a temporary CEO put in, and then I was asked to run that company for a period of time, which I did for I think 3 years, right? The challenge we had then was SMS. Like, no one thinks about SMS in 2020, right? It's gone completely almost. So we were in a business where we knew the technology was being made redundant. So that's very tricky. So you're in a scenario there where you can either try and reinvent yourself, which is very hard, or you can buy up businesses as they in the decline. And so we chose the latter strategy. And that wasn't, I suppose, when you're in a public company, it's not necessarily your decision. You've got a board, and it's the shareholders' decision ultimately, right? But that's the view we took. And that, from a cash point of view, so ultimately for the business, that was a good decision. But for that, over time, as SMS declined, the business declined, right? And then ultimately shut down, right? So I suppose it's one of those things. You have to look at something coldly sometimes in business and go, what is the best financial result? And that we did the right strategy, albeit it wasn't maybe the most pleasant journey working in a business that is in decline, right? But that's the view you have to take. It's kind of like sometimes, though, like, I think I've learned more in challenging situations or challenging days than in better days, right? So sometimes when you're in a challenging environment, you look back on it now and you go, okay, that was tough. I didn't enjoy that meeting, or that was heated, but actually you learned a lot. And that's kind of what happened in that scenario.
I think we learn in both times. I think we learn in challenging times, there's no doubt, and we get an understanding of maybe what has caused the challenges and how we responded to those. But I think I believe we also learn in the good times, because sometimes though we don't actually listen to the good times or look at the good times. We just take them for granted. So the good times are taken for granted, and the challenging times we spend a bit more focus on. So that's why I think at times we learn more from the challenging times. It's because we focus more on that aspect of our business, and we just take for granted on occasions how good we are at times. And I would always encourage clients to look at both with an equal balance. But if I bring you to the start of 2020, then you're running a company called CarsIreland.ie.
Yeah.
So just talk to me about, this time last year, which seems so long ago in many ways, January 2020. What was your view of the year ahead for yourself and for your business?
Yeah, okay. So, well, first of all, CarsIreland.ie, it's a marketplace for buying cars online. And online obviously has had a dramatic year, right? Given that we all thought that the world would get increasingly more digital, right? And then what would have taken 5 years has happened in 1 year, right? In terms of how things have gone digital, right?
But in January, Ross, that wasn't what we expected. So go back to January 2020, we didn't expect that the world would have a 5 years explosion in digital in 1 year. As we started 2020, COVID has actually dramatically focused that. So if we just go back to January, you weren't expecting this boom of digital world unless you were a prophet that most of us didn't expect. So what was your business like just at the start of this time last year, your expectations and your views for what was lying ahead for you?
Yeah, so for the start of last year, we ended up the first few months on budget, on plan of where we were going. We were gradually transforming our business, and we're basically a product development company or a platform company. And we were gradually moving, and I would say at pace, but then not the pace that was required in hindsight, right? Obviously, I had only, I think, 20 people with a small company then, right, working underneath us. We're part of independent news and media, so we're not part of the newspaper. So we're kind of a business within a big, with a business. So I would say I wasn't too stressed about the year ahead, right? Last year, right? I kind of thought we were on plan. We were going up at a reasonable pace, likely to make our budget for the year, likely to grow, and there was no stresses at all, right? I was pretty confident about the business outlook. I thought, look, the Irish economy, maybe it would. I thought maybe. If you remember back to the start of the year, you could see there was a bit of a bull market going on the stock market there, so it was likely to have maybe to stagnate a little bit. But I think most of us were pretty optimistic, right, for the year ahead, right. Now, actually, in hindsight, because I look back on my notes in January last year, I did actually write a thing that I thought COVID might impact a little bit, because back in January it was actually out there, right, but I had no idea really, right? I thought it might have a little blip, right? But look, what turns out has been completely different, right?
So obviously the blip didn't happen. It became an explosion and a storm, and some would call it the perfect storm in some ways. How did you respond? How did you pivot? What were the things that you did first of all, you said in January, you saw, your notes remind you that you did see COVID will have some impact. A blip was your description, but obviously as it progressed, how did you pivot? How did you deal with the things that faced you and faced your business?
Yeah, like I remember actually when the lockdown was announced, right, the day, right, I'll never forget it, right, I was in a meeting and I came down and my entire staff were there going, okay, we're leaving in an hour. Right. And I was like, what? I'd missed the announcement. That I knew that week, it kind of, if you remember, it ratcheted up that week. And then it was the Thursday, the announcement that was just before Paddy's week. And I describe it as complete chaos. Right. So I work in, my software supports effectively small, medium business, which are car dealers in the car industry in Ireland. Right. I describe it as complete chaos for 2 months. Basically trying to support small businesses. They shifted online, right, effectively, but didn't have much money. They were all very nervous. I mean, you have to remember that back in April, May, it was a panic, basically, right, out there, right? And then what happened for us in that period was what we tried to do was keep our revenue at a reasonable, I mean, it dropped significantly, but keep our revenue at a reasonable level. We didn't put any of our staff on the furlough, right? We chose not to. We decided actually it was better to support our customers in the transition and take a financial hit, and we thought we'd recover rather than putting half our staff on furlough and keeping the business whatever EBITDA positive. That's the view we took, right? And in hindsight, that worked, but it was back then you didn't really realize, right? So I knew I was kind of going, God, will my revenue be down 50%, 60%? I had no idea, right? So you were kind of faced with those kind of challenges then, right? And you go on your instinct and you go and you think what's right. And it turned out okay, but it was pretty hairy for a few weeks, right? Plus, you're like Zoom and stuff is all very like it's all kind of familiar now, but even back then that people weren't used to it, right? And even doing group meetings or gallery views that we have now, or even just simple communication, like it's very hard to like if you want to just ask someone a very quick question, it's very hard to do it now. Like you can't just go, oh hey, what's the story with this? Because they're not in front of you. So you have to change the way you work to be way more structured and organized, right? So, a very chaotic month or two. And at the same time, in that period, we decided to buy a company, called Cartel, which we bought it in July. So, chaos completely, I would describe it as.
So you have your customers are struggling in a panic and chaotic manner. Your staff, you decided to keep them on, but the concern is that what impact does that have on the revenues and the financials of the organization? And then you decide to purchase a company, so there's an opportunistic aspect of the chaos. And how do you pull it all together then? Because there's so many different aspects of that. There's the customers, who have their own concerns, who have their own challenges about what's going on in their world, obviously, right? You have concerns and challenges about what's going on in your business world, and then you decide that, well, there's an opportunity to buy a new company. So how did you pull that all together?
Yeah, look, I was very, very fortunate to have a few really good people on my team, right, who worked very hard and who were very experienced, right, in the industry, right. If we didn't have that, there's no chance it would have worked. And then you're into in hindsight, you're into kind of shared values and culture, right? Like a lot of my team, they probably didn't have to work as hard as they did, but they did, right? And I think a lot of them realized, like the fact that we put no one on furlough, like I think that helped a lot of people out, and they were aware of this, right? We never actually spoke about it publicly, right? They didn't have to. And then when you try and buy a company, yeah, that's very tough, like because obviously it's all done virtually, right? Like the company we bought have offices. I still have never been in the office, right? Because of it's in a different county. It's in Kildare, and you're just not allowed to travel. You were only for that period of Christmas, and we all know what happened there. So very difficult. I suppose you just kind of have to bust through. I mean, like failure is not really an option. You just have to find a way, and you just have to back yourself to kind of go, okay, look, I haven't got all this figured out, but if I put it in a process, I will figure it out. And like, for example, when we bought that company Cartel, we had a team around us, and we had a kind of a mentor to help us, and we had a call every week. And you just communicate your problems, and you share your problems with other people, and you just get through it, right?
You made a point about organization being very important in communication, and it challenged you to be much more organized. Just tease that out a bit for me.
Yeah, so we took a few kind of major steps in lockdown. So the first thing is we use a chat system called Slack. I'm not sure you're familiar with it, right? So the way we've kind of taken Slack is like just a, hey, how are you? Like, good morning. And it actually, it facilitates people to kind of have just conversations, even jokes and things, just as if people are next to them. So we integrate that in within 1 week or something, I can't remember, right? And that helped us a lot, because that meant you could just, without scheduling meetings, you could just ask questions or do quick calls and stuff, right? And then the other change we made was we cut out internal email in our company, and we launched a kind of a task management system, right? And the reason for that was we found it very hard to explain to people, like if you want something done and people are working remotely, the person who's asking has to go to extreme detail to explain, because it's very hard to have conversations, right? Sometimes. So we brought in, so basically, instead of writing a chat, it more puts kind of context and data related to what you want, like priority and timelines. And so we structured everyone's day and effectively created a task management system for the entire company. So people had their day structured, and their productivity wouldn't drop, right? Coupled with that, obviously, we had weekly meetings on updates, and the view we took on it was to be completely transparent with our staff on pretty much everything, right? On, look, let's say if we had a bad week or something, or things weren't where I wouldn't call it hairy, but like things weren't, the performance was down significantly, which it was. We just told people, and we found that people were quite receptive to that, right? And they actually, I think it's sometimes actually they I don't think they followed everything. I think the fact they knew it was there, they trusted us because we were telling them right as it is, right? So, and trust became, in hindsight, pretty important, right? During the lockdown, right? If you didn't trust your boss, like during the lockdown, let's just say you probably had a bit of trouble, I would have thought, right? Anyone, right? Because it's communications, like it's very easy to miss things, right? Because you can't just, like in the olden days, like you could just walk up to someone and have a quick chat. That's not possible now, right? So you have to, you really need to trust people.
So you pivoted the organization, from being organized. You talked about Slack and other tools. Communication was very important to you, and obviously trust. I suppose the development of trust and the evidence of trust became much more relevant as the COVID time went on. As we sit here now, how do you look forward for your business? Tell me, about the journey ahead for you.
Yeah, so during COVID, the other thing we've done is we decided to completely rebuild our whole platform. And we were kind of doing this anyway in the background, but not at the pace that we ultimately did it, right? So we kind of took the view that in the future, and we thought the future was 5 years away, future's tomorrow suddenly, right? That in our case, that no one's really going to buy a car by going to a car dealership anymore. They're all going to buy it fully online. And how do you facilitate that? Bearing in mind that there are 1,500 car dealers in Ireland, so we've 1,500 small businesses to facilitate, right? And what we did there was, we're actually about to launch it next week. It took us, but we developed it completely from home, remotely, right? And the way we went about it was, well, first of all, was to make sure we're aligned. We went through kind of a process. The first question you have to yourself is, you're putting that hypothesis out there. This is what we think we're going to do. And then you make sure by just user feedback and by going through a process, you have to be 100% sure that you're aligning to the market, right? So, and that's kind of hard, right? And that takes, in reality, it takes months, right, to refine and get that right. And then you go through a kind of a build phase and then a validation phase where you go back to your market, right? And then you make sure that what you've built is what the user wants, right? And yeah, so we've gone through that phase, and the way we approached it was we kind of looked at peers in just completely different industries, and we kind of, I wouldn't call it copy, but you kind of look at, I don't know, let's say, for example, on clever things on Amazon, how that works. You kind of go, okay, could we apply that concept to us? So what we built is effectively by taking ideas from industries that have, in most cases, nothing to do with us, but and then just putting it all together, right, in a way that users can understand, right, and then the user can understand with no manual, right, as in 1 second, right. That's kind of the trick, right. So we spent the last 9 months working on that, launching next week.
Well, Ross, from the days in your friendship building in the Sea Scouts in Dunleary to your journey through college to Gaeilge, and then your understanding of the benefits of tech and commerce, it has brought you to where you are today, which has been a fascinating insight that you've shared with us here today on the Mindset Shift. I want to thank you so sincerely. I really enjoyed it, the business aspect, the personal aspect of this chat, and I wish you well with the launch of the new platform and look forward to chatting to you again in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for watching The Mindset Shift. Don't forget to subscribe to get a new episode delivered straight to your inbox. You can do this by following the details below.